Good evening, everyone. This is the Community Formation Commission meeting for July 28th, 2021. I'll call the meeting to order at 5:35 p.m. And Sam, we can go into roll call.
Cool, thank you. Commissioner Adam Malikan? Absent. Commissioner Alonso?
Present.
Commissioner Wood? Absent. Commissioner Chavez?
Present.
Chair Escobedo?
Here.
Commissioner Kim Johnson? Commissioner Rachel Johnson? No, she is online. Commissioner Killebrew? Commissioner Jacob Lesnar Buxton? Commissioner O'Gorman?
Here.
Commissioner Lizzie Rodriguez?
Here.
Commissioner Sander?
Here.
And Commissioner or Vice Chair Zepeda? And Commissioner Lewis Reynell. Okay, that completes roll call. Chair?
Thank you. And so next we'll move into public comment for items that are not on our agenda for today.
There is no one in public comment, Chair.
Okay, so we'll close public comment and we'll move on to the administrative agenda, which item A is going to be consideration and action of the draft Community Formation Commission meeting minutes for July 14th, 2021. And are there any changes to the meeting minutes for July 14th? And if not, can we get a motion to approve the meeting minutes for July 14th?
So moved.
And a second?
I second.
Okay. So we have Christian with the first, Lizzie with the second, and we can do a voice vote on, or actually, do we want to open up public comment for this? Is there anyone?
Sure, Chair. There are no attendees in public comment.
Okay, so then we can move on to the voice vote.
Okay. There's motion by Commissioner Alonso, seconded by Commissioner Rodriguez to approve the administrative agenda as presented. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Just item A.
Oh, I apologize. Motion by Commissioner Alonso, seconded by Commissioner Rodriguez for the acceptance of the minutes as presented for July 14th. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Against? Motion passes.
Awesome. So we'll go on to item B. It's going to be consideration and action on the tentative Community Formation Commission timeline that is on the Community Formation Commission website, and we all should have reviewed prior to this. Sam, is it possible to pull those up?
Yes, give me one. Let me make. So I'm not sure if this is big enough for the group to see, but this is what is on the Community Formation website.
And so I'll open it up. Are there any changes that anyone would like to see, or any discussion that would like to be had on the timeline? Mary?
Hi, I guess it's more discussion. I don't know changes. And I'm assuming, Cammie, this is essentially what you walked us through last 2 weeks ago? I mean,
yes.
Okay.
I put it together based on the comments that you made in
Gotcha.
last meeting.
Yeah, and as always, it's, seeing something on paper sometimes get a little different perspective. One thing that jumps out at me, for instance, it says decision regarding model recommendation July, which, I mean, I think obviously that's not possible. So I'm wondering, since that's probably one of the most important decisions we'll make as a group. So I don't see how we lay the foundation and have a robust discussion and decision on that. So what I'm wondering, can we expand? I don't know, or what does anyone else think? So that's one part. And then the other part is looking at, since what we're looking at is doing the presentation in March, basically, if we're saying we're going to have our final recommendation in October, we're essentially November, December, January, kind of cheating ourselves out of 4 months of what's already a tight timeline. And I was here when we talked about this. So again, maybe it's just seeing it on paper. So I'm wondering if that's something that maybe, I don't know, Cami, if anybody's thoughts, or am I just crazy?
I agree with Commissioner Gorman that is the expectation that tonight we are going to vote on the recommended model. If that's not the case, then we should probably move that to August. But I also understand that this is a working timeline. It's flexible, it's adjustable. It's not concretized. So I'm okay with it being fluid like that. But if we are setting goals that we do hope to meet, then we can probably move that one to August.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Tammy.
I was just going to jump in. I agree with the comment that I think that actually everything on this timeline, you have to consider that may have to be pushed a little later, some of the things, and that probably at the beginning of each meeting, kind of re-examine what you were able to accomplish at the last one and what that means for what needs to happen at the current one. I think that if you had a full commission this evening, and a good conversation, you might have been able to get it done. I think one of the things that I thought about is really tonight is a great night, since it's really one of the only major things on the agenda, and you're gonna have this presentation from the working group, that you'll be able to walk through and discuss a lot of it. And then at the next meeting, probably make a decision. I don't know if it's important to move it to August, just for the sake of having it there. It looks like that's when you'll actually make your final decision. But I think what you're going to find is there are going to be lots of things that get moved along the way.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really up to you and how you guys want. I mean, if you want to make sure that there's always a at least the most accurate as you can make it timeline for view by the public, then I would suggest, if you think that it will take more than one meeting, particularly if we get to the end of the meeting and you feel like we're going to need to do this at the next one, the final call, then you can decide to move that. And I think you can do that at the end of every meeting.
Well, I guess I'm curious, because if other people think we can do this, maybe I'm missing something. Because the recommendation for a model is essentially that's our kind of our primary goal, I guess. And so when I was contemplating, having discussion on it, probably over the next few meetings, I'm thinking of all the things that go into a final recommendation, such as, setting the table. What are our needs? Since, in Cami, I read your NACOL, the whole study last, and it talks about needing a best fit versus a best practice. So us identifying that best fit kind of comes down to a lot of other things we've all been looking at in some of our other committees, and what exists now. That's just my thought, but
this is a very important part of the discussion, and I don't know if this helps ease anybody's mind, but it's kind of like once you make the decision about a model, it's really laying the base of which you're going to build everything else on. And so there are a lot more decisions to be made that can't be made until you have that piece finished. So it is important that it is something that happens sooner rather than later. I think that you guys may have the presentation and a discussion, and you might surprise yourselves. You might be like, oh, well, we want this, and maybe a little bit of this on the side. I mean, so we don't know that until you have the conversation. But there's also, I will say, there isn't a city that we have worked with that hasn't at some point gone back and say, you know what, can we think about this in a different way now that we're building? Are we sure that we have the base exactly the way we want it? And so there are some ways that you can go back. I mean, until you give that presentation in March, there is room for movement. So I don't know if that gives you any ease of mind, but I thought I would throw that out there.
Christian.
Yeah, Commissioner O'Gorman, I think because we've had so many presentations up until this point and reading, outlaying the basic function and requirements of the various model types. Speaking on behalf of myself, I feel pretty comfortable in making a determination on which direction we want to move. But to your point, I think we should be careful in the language of the motion of what we approve to give ourselves the ability to go back and add. But I would like to have, and this is just speaking on behalf of myself and the reasoning why I brought up a straw poll that you initially brought up meetings ago, that we get some kind of, because we have to do community outreach and we're kind of the front lines of that community outreach. So I think getting a sense of what directionally we would like to see is how we start the process, and then go back as we do this. I view this as an iterative process to get to the ultimate recommendation, but I think we need to start with what kinds of models do we want to focus on so that we can start crafting similar outreach to other folks in the community.
Yeah, no, and I did bring up straw poll a few months ago just to see individually where we all were at, but so yeah. Is someone talking?
Might be feedback from someone's mic. Any other feedback from it, Rich?
Yeah, I'd say it may be because I was in the model group, so we discussed this a lot more, and I feel like my eyes have been on it a lot more. That being said, I think as we look at the different models, I'm already feeling that we're leaning towards one certain way because it would adapt to our what we can do. And so I think like I'd say if we move forward right now and we at least have the discussion and begin starting to talk about it, I'd love to see where we are at by the end of tonight. And then I think that would answer a lot more of kind of your questions, Commissioner O'Gorman, of how soon we make a recommendation or what on the model alone. That's my 2 cents.
So another option, if I could throw it out there, is maybe we table this and then we see where we're at the end of the night, and then we'll have a better sense of whether or not we're close to a decision. We do have quite a few commissioners missing, so the option of continuing the discussion to next meeting is also an option. But that's I'll just throw that out there, and maybe
You need
you
to
all can
have the
provide me.
discussion, have the discussion tonight and then finish it next time. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's an option for later. And then
Mhm.
what we could do now is just table this, and after having the discussion, we'll probably have a better sense of what the timeline would look like.
Oh, I see. By this, you mean timeline. All right.
Yeah, correct.
I see what you're saying. Okay. Yeah.
How's that sound to everyone?
Sure.
Awesome.
And move it to the end of the meeting or something.
Yeah, John, can we just move it to the end of the meeting? And how does that work? Do we need a motion?
Absolutely. You can have a motion just and then a second. And you can move it on as a change to the agenda. Chair Escobedo, absolutely.
Okay. Do we have a motion to move this to the end of the meeting?
I'll
So
make
moved.
that.
And
I'll second.
Perfect. Mary with the first, Christian with the second, and then voice vote, please, Sam.
Sure. So just want to confirm that there's a motion to continue the item 4B until the end of the meeting, made by Commissioner Gorman, seconded by Alonso. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Against? Motion passes.
Perfect. So that takes us to item 5, which is really our only big item today, which is discussion on civilian oversight models. And so we are going to receive a presentation from the Oversight Models Work Group, and then have a discussion facilitated by Cami on oversight models. So I'll turn it over to the work group.
Okay, so we have presented this presentation once before, although I'm sure all of you could use a refresher. I learn new things every single time I read about all of these different models, so I think it would be helpful for us to go through it. So just as a reminder, our working group is the Model Research Group, and we are taking it upon ourselves to be the Community Formation Committee experts on these different model types, and what other cities are using, how to incorporate the best practices and successes of other city efforts into our recommendations to our own city council. So what we have done here is simplified the dense information available on these into this model summary presentation. We've made a couple of additions since then, and I'll point those out as we go along here. But largely it's the same summarized information. We're seeking feedback on this presentation to continuously improve it from all folks here. We've also started to study some of the successful proposals from other commissions like our own. And we also have an additional presentation that Serafina worked on to talk about what a successful proposal looks like. And so we look forward to presenting that at a future meeting as well, maybe when we start talking about the writing and drafting working group. So just to remind everyone, we'll start here. There are 4 civilian review system types that are currently being used by oversight bodies in the United States. Technically, there are only 3, but the hybrid, the 4th one, is a combination of these other 3 types. So there are technically 4. So they are, just as a reminder, review, auditor monitor, investigation, and hybrid. If we could go to the next slide. The most common type that basically enables community input on the quality of completed internal affairs investigations for misconduct complaints is the review model. It's important to remember that the review model does not have to be limited to just completed internal investigations. You can also empower these review boards with additional authority to refer misconduct complaints for internal affairs investigations You can send back inadequate investigations for further review. And you can also make other recommendations, these boards, to existing administrative functions. So you have a couple of different avenues available to you with the review model type. We go to the next slide. So it has been great to get the presentation from Lieutenant Hill a couple meetings ago, as well as the review of existing policies in the police station, that working group, the police department, with their internal affairs process, and we've seen some of that as well. So there's, this policy training and hiring, that working group that's doing, helping us understand what's already existing. And so we have to have a good understanding with all these different model types of what, if anything, the resulting oversight body will change about our existing administrative functions. So all of them include some changes to the existing administrative functions. And in a previous presentation, we had characterized the lightness and heaviness of changes to administrative functions. Our group decided that that's not a good way to characterize these because they are varied, and to just clearly write out what those changes would be as opposed to characterizing them. So we wanted to be careful not to mischaracterize the changes or potential changes. And so here with the review model, we have some changes where basically it's going to sit on top of existing functions, right? Those existing internal affairs processes, investigations, and give them the ability to make recommendations to police executives on potential follow-up actions. We go to the next slide. So just as a reminder, the review model is used in multiple cities in California, as well as across the United States. In cities like Santa Cruz, which is very similar in size to Santa Barbara. We go to the next slide. So you'll notice, for those of you that pay really close attention, that we changed the order of this presentation because what we've learned recently with the new report from NACOL, it was the delayed research report that Commissioner O'Gorman was talking about, and that I recommend everybody comb through. It's about 90 pages or so, but it goes into very in-depth detail on the various model types. But what we learned is that actually the auditor monitor model is the second most adopted model. It is the fastest growing model being adopted by commissions throughout the US. And so here we have a model that really focuses trained staff doing the work of dissecting the data on department misconduct investigations to identify patterns and to make proactive recommendations on systemic policy and behavior changes. So these systems tend to have wide authority to audit various aspects of police department pattern and practice. And if we could go to the next slide. In terms of the administrative changes that we could expect with the auditor monitor type, we would see that you would need to replace or duplicate some existing processes with a more independent process, right? A more independent board of review. And so you would also have to provide some kind of guidance on the authority of the staff or the accompanying board to recommend or make decisions on subpoenas, imposing discipline, and other investigation related authority. So on the next slide, we also have some examples of cities that are currently using, oh, sorry, I totally screwed up. This is the investigation model, but we've moved it in order and I forgot to move this slide. We go to the next slide. Anyway, remember Berkeley and these other folks for the investigation one. But here we have the investigation focused model. Basically, this model requires the services of trained staff to independently investigate misconduct allegations, and ultimately replacing critical functions of the existing internal affairs process. So the staff in this model typically have more authority to subpoena information like body or dashboard camera footage and other documentation or witnesses through the course of an investigation. Oftentimes, these are accompanied by some kind of board or commission that advises those staff and helps with the decision making. We go to the next slide. Yeah, actually, I have this all messed up. If we go back, actually, two or three slides, and I apologize for this. Yeah, to this one, I had my notes mixed up here, and I saw some of you like go cross-eyed on the on like, what's he talking about? So apologies. So I want to revisit the changes that we need to make to administrative functions on auditor monitor, because basically this would sit on top of the internal affairs machinery like the review model, but tend to have broader authority and can actively participate in open investigations or advise and enforce best practices. So depending on the scope of the authority that we would want to give an auditor monitor model, right, which is focused on proactive assessment, analyzing trends and patterns in pattern and practice, and making recommendations and trying to get ahead. So depending on the scope of that authority, it can have broad implications for changing, how a department ultimately conducts investigations. Okay, now we go forward back to the investigation model. Apologies for the snafu here. Back to the one more. Okay, so the information on the slides is correct, but my notes were wrong. So apologies on mixing those up. But basically, this model, the investigation model, where you actually have trained staff doing the investigating, working perhaps with a board or commission, advising on decision making. The changes here that I mistakenly said for the auditor monitor would require some kind of guidance on how the trained staff that are conducting the investigations, or the accompanying board to recommend or make decisions on subpoenas, imposing discipline, and other investigation related authority. So I'm going to stop right there because I confused that a lot. Does anyone have any questions immediately on those two things? Okay. So, and we'll talk about this at the end as well, because we have to get through the presentation. So if we could go to the next slide. Again, I mix these up. So the auditor monitor is used in a lot of different cities, but investigation, you saw Berkeley, you saw Anaheim, and now we're moving on to the hybrid model. So the hybrid approach is gaining in popularity for how oversight is done in the US, and it is perceived as the best choice by many to get a custom fit for your community. So as the name implies, it often involves a combination of oversight functions borrowed from other models. So the previous three ones, right? Review, auditor, monitor, investigation. Most important thing we have to consider if we wanted to go with a hybrid model would be to decide if we want to take it, if we want the model, the model of civilian oversight, to take the form of either a hybrid agency or a hybrid system. And so a hybrid agency is basically one oversight body that performs multiple functions, whereas a hybrid system would be multiple agencies working together to perform different oversight functions over the same municipal police department, in this case, the Santa Barbara City Police Department. A hybrid system could look like an independent investigative agency and an inspector general, for example. If we go up to the next slide. In terms of how this would impact administrative functions, Obviously, that really depends on which of these two systems or hybrid types that we decide to go with. So it can obviously range, in the changes that are going to happen. You've seen a lot from the previous model types on what those changes involve and how it sits on top of existing processes and internal affairs in the police department. But depending on how we want to go or which of these systems we choose will ultimately determine the changes that can accommodate those different models that are working together and what will potentially be replaced or supplemented from the existing internal affairs functions. And of course, we really do have to emphasize and understand, all of us individually and together, the differences between an agency, which is one group doing multiple functions, and a system, a hybrid system, which is multiple agencies working together to oversee the entity. So we go to the next slide. I pulled this data from the NACL's research publication in the COAD directory, this database that we'll talk more about in a minute as well. I highly recommend everybody dig into it. But I was personally curious about how common certain hybrid oversight models are, right? What are the different combinations? How common are they? We have the answer here. Obviously, in the report, it says that this warrants more research, and I tend to agree. There's a lot of different intricacies happening here, but the data as it currently stands shows the commonality of these different model types. And so there's a lot of data here, but if we take a look at the right-hand side, that column where it says all agencies aggregated together, one thing that you'll notice, and the biggest takeaway here, is that about 3/4 of agencies currently doing civilian oversight are reporting that they review completed internal affairs investigations. So that review function, whether that be because it's less resource intensive or what have you, tends to be something that most, or at least 3/4 of civilian oversight commissions perform. You can also see here some other examples of combinations that are more or less frequent, but here's the data that we have today that kind of shows that for all of you, in case you were curious. And we can have further discussions about this or revisit this later. We go to the next slide. Again, and this is a typo. Wow, I really need to go back and spell check. But if we go back one slide, these are some common hybrid communities that are implementing that in California. So Los Angeles, Oakland, San Diego, for example. And if we could go to the next slide, we showed this summary of all of the types, right? Kind of indicating that investigation focus tends to be the most expensive, review tends to be the least expensive, hybrids tending to be more complex than just a simple review process, right? Because of the eccentricities happening there. There's like little puzzle piece images that still didn't make it through, so I have to change that. But what the biggest request that we got from the group at the last presentation was to go into more than just these dollar signs and really break down what the costs look like based on the existing data. And so because of the help of the COAD database, if we go to the next slide, we were able to get a little bit more data on this for all of you. So that database, right, where you could go to directory.nacl.org and look at this information for yourself, we were actually able to pull the average costs or the estimated cost of these based on this aggregated data. So there are some interesting facets of the data, like for example, one very large municipal jurisdiction reported that their oversight cost $3 billion, but they also reported that their total police budget is $3 billion. So obviously an outlier there, and I tried to remove a couple of the outliers like that didn't make sense. That was the one outlier actually that I removed from this data. But if we could go to the next slide. I wanted to start with a couple of different cuts of the data and the overall cost. So where I first started was all oversight agencies that oversee a municipal police department. So there are the previous data that you saw are municipal oversight that oversees like university police in California and other places in the United States. We also saw in that data jurisdictions that oversee both a sheriff's department and a city police department, for example. So there's lots of different examples out there. For here, we're looking at just the average costs that you see for jurisdictions overseeing just a municipal police department. So you can see the average and median costs here. Not a lot that's surprising here. Investigation focus being the more expensive models, right, with paid trained staff and perhaps a commission associated with it. And then review focused being on the lower end, and auditor monitor being similar. If we go to the next slide. I also wanted to take a cut at, okay, so the previous slide was aggregated ones. And I understand that that is confusing here. So I'll make sure I change some of these headings, but this one is the just a municipal police department. And you see the same patterns there. And if we go to the next slide, this one, I wanted to give us a look at populations, and we filtered out for this cut of the data, municipal police departments that serve more than 150,000 people. So we looked at just folks that oversee city police departments and serve a population of fewer than 150,000 people, which is about double the size of Santa Barbara. And there's obviously a lot in there that match the population size of Santa Barbara. So here you can see the average and median costs for these, pretty much the same patterns, with review being the least expensive, investigation being the most expensive, and auditor monitor being somewhere in between those two things. And if we go to the next slide, so that was supposed to be the header for this, but that is like a snapshot of what the average costs are based on this aggregated data. And it definitely warrants more study by the group and by all of us to look at that COAD database and look at these average and median costs so we can get a better idea of what the financial impact of our ultimate recommendations are going to be to the city council. And maybe perhaps, provide that level of detail. And even, if we wanted to take a cut of just 90,000. But in my conversations with Cami, our group's conversations with Cami, one thing that all of the groups say pretty consistently is that no matter what the budget, it's not enough. And they all could use more resources and more budget. And so that's an important thing to consider. And then also the kinds of return on investment that we get for reducing or having effective oversight of police misconduct. So all things to consider for the costs. We go to the next slide. I think this is the end of the presentation. Awesome. Thank God you're all tired of hearing me talk. But let's open it up for discussion then.
Yeah, and Cami, if you want to take over facilitating.
Sure. Thank you so much, Christian. That was great information. And thank you for proving, I've been really excited about the COAD database internally for like 4 years. And I'm so glad someone's actually able to use it now. And we are, since we released the COAD database, we've had, I think 4 new agencies add to it. They're not in it yet. They've sent us their information, and you're right. There are always some outliers with the database, with the data, because it's self-reporting, and we try to catch all of the crazy numbers that happen to come in that you see and you're like, there's no way that's right. But as Christian pointed out, we have missed a couple along the way, but so I'm glad that that is good, has worked well for you guys. So I jotted some notes down, kind of a process for us to follow in this conversation. I did not want to narrow you to too much of a roadmap, because I'd really like all of you to feel comfortable in talking about what you want to with these models. But I did want to kind of throw out a few things that I just want you guys to keep in the back of your head as you're having this conversation. Since, as we all noted earlier on, this is a really important piece of the process. And I apologize for the froggy voice. I'm going to try to get through and still have it at the end. So first of all, I want you all to remember that there are several paths to success. That choosing one over another doesn't mean that you could potentially make the wrong choice. It means that what you're doing is looking at what is best for Santa Barbara. So along those lines, I also want you to think about developing an oversight model needs to allow for flexibility, but still take into consideration the criteria that is crucial for successful and effective oversight. So an example of this is, you're creating a model, and although we're not talking about board composition today, it's just a really easy example for this. You want to have board composition that makes, if you have a review board as part of this, you want it to represent the community that the board is serving. However, you don't want to make it so inflexible and so complicated that you have problems filling those seats. We have some problems at this point with a couple of agencies in the country who have longstanding vacancies on their board, because that particular vacancy must be filled by someone that is of some certain aspect of the community, whether that is race, sexual orientation, like there are so many factors. And so that is something that you want to keep in mind. Important to represent your community and to make something that's very effective, but make sure there's a little bit of flexibility in there so that you don't pigeonhole yourself into something that may have unintended consequences. I also want you to keep in the back of your mind the core values and principles that need to be satisfied to produce better outcomes in policing. Maybe that is a system that supports robust reporting practices, or maybe for you that desired outcome are being able to make policy recommendations. So those are some of the things we're going to talk about, what's important, but I want all of you to keep in mind, what are those desired outcomes that you want? You want transparency, accountability. And then lastly, something to keep in mind is, and all of you have been so cognizant of this throughout, is that stakeholder input and the dialogue that you have with your stakeholders is really going to need to be a valued part of the process. So although you are all here and you're representing your community, I'm really impressed by the commitment to making sure that this information also is communicated with the community and a dialogue exists. So with all of those fairly complex things that I've asked for you to keep in the back of your mind, not only today, but throughout the process, I wanted to start with if anyone had any questions about the models. Were there certain things in that presentation that you wonder, how does that work in practice? Any terminology that you didn't understand? I think it's a good time for us to start asking questions so that we understand in as much detail as possible what each of these system types can do.
I was wondering if, Cami, we could go through some more examples of what the difference is between a hybrid agency and a hybrid system, There are some good examples in the NACOL report that I didn't say here, but I think it's incumbent, if we want to consider a hybrid, that we all understand the difference, right? So agency overseeing, or one group overseeing multiple functions versus a system which is multiple agencies, right, working together to do oversight. And I was wondering if you could give some examples of, especially those that you view to be successful, either an agency or a hybrid system.
Yes, absolutely. So let's start with the hybrid system. So there are several cities, and I will say that often when it is a hybrid system, we see them in larger cities. A great example is Seattle. They have 3 different oversight bodies. And one of them is the Office of Professional Accountability. And essentially, it's interesting. It's a different investigative model than we see, I think, anywhere else in the country, where they have replaced the head of internal affairs with a civilian. And so internal affairs is made up of also of both sworn law enforcement and civilian investigators. And so it's somewhat of a hybrid in itself, but they have been very successful in being able to work within the law enforcement agency, but also provide some independent investigation. In addition to that, they also have the Office of the Inspector General, who is almost like an umbrella and provides an auditing function and a very, very robust reporting mechanism for all of the other oversight that's going on in Seattle, as well as looking and doing audits of some of the policies and procedures within the Seattle Police Department. And then lastly, you have the Community Police Commission, which is made up of community members from throughout Seattle. It's a very diverse group of individuals who help to, they're very, very good at community outreach and looking at the issues that are affecting the community most as in regards to law enforcement. So they have a very successful model. I will say that doesn't keep them from tweaking it. They have recently, I think in the last 5 years, they've been, they're in a new phase of oversight there. So they're constantly learning from the practices of how they might improve. Another example is Chicago, who has the Civilian Oversight Police. Remembering all of the different acronyms can be difficult. It's called COPA, so I think it's the Civilian Oversight Police, Civilian Office for Police Accountability. And so they do independent investigations. There is also the Chicago Police Board, who they review investigations, they make disciplinary recommendations, and they have been around for a very long time. That's the oldest piece of oversight in Chicago, is that board. And then they also have within the City of Chicago's Office of the Inspector General a Deputy Inspector General that's in charge of public safety. So they act much like the one in Seattle does, but they aren't their own office. They're underneath the Inspector General. And I just read today that the City Council in Chicago has moved to have elected commissioners to a police oversight entity, much like Detroit has. So that'll be a whole new level of oversight there that they have not seen as of yet. But there's also some, let's move on to kind of the hybrid agency, because that's we see that much more often, particularly in the medium to small size cities. And what that looks like, a great example of that is, well, Madison. It's a newer agency. They have a civilian review board who is in charge of actually hiring the police monitor. And so there is kind of that monitoring and auditing function that will happen in that agency because of the monitor. And then they also have the review board who will do community outreach. They will work hand in hand with the monitor on policy, procedure, and training recommendations. And if they want, if they deem it necessary, they are able to initiate independent investigations, either on their own or as a result of not being satisfied with the investigation that's being done. And then I will mention, so there are lots like that. Even in a city like Washington, D.C., where we have what is always called an investigative model, they still have a review board attached to it. So it is becoming very difficult to find an oversight agency that in some way has not become a hybrid. One of the only ones that that exists, well, there are lots of that exist just as review boards. But when we get to the auditor monitor and the investigative model pieces, we often find review boards attached to them so that there can also be a community piece in the process. The only one, an example of one that is just a pure auditor monitor model is the one in New Orleans, where they have a sizable office that does a lot of community outreach, but they are the independent police monitor, and there is not a group of citizens or a civilian review board attached to them. They do have created civilian panels, though, to make sure that they're doing the type of community outreach they'd like to. So there is that piece as well. Any other questions? Kim?
Question. So thank you for that outline. So,
Kim, I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing you. It's very staticky.
okay, I'll pause. Thank you, guys.
Commissioner Johnson, if you want to put your question in the chat, that might help as well.
While we're waiting for Kim to do that, does anybody else have any other questions?
I don't know if it's a question or just, you know, trying to think of the best ways that we can actually, you know, start to do our discussion or brainstorming or whatever, whatever we want to call it, straw polling or I guess.
So what I was hoping to do is if there were specific questions about the models themselves, I wanted to kind of get those out there so people could feel comfortable with each of the models, that they had a good understanding of them. And then what I'm hoping to do is have some conversations about what people are feeling is important about each of the models to them. I think part of that conversation needs to be, what do you feel is feasible? What do you feel your community, because it's not always what is important and what is feasible can be two different conversations, but I think it's really important to have them. And then I do think that by the end of this conversation, I would really like people to start expressing their thoughts. And in the end, what I'm hoping to do, I'm taking notes. I would like to kind of compose a summary of where we are in this, and knowing that the commissioners that are unable to join will hopefully watch the recording, that then allow people, because I have a feeling that as we leave this meeting tonight, people will have additional thoughts and questions, to have those sent directly to me so that we can kind of process that information. I can give additional information at the beginning of the next meeting so that if we do in fact have that next meeting, we're able to kind of move right into where everybody is in the conversation. So that is what I have envisioned. That is not set in stone, but because I also would like to drive the conversation based on what all of you need out of it.
Mhm.
I have a question. Would this body, the CFC, be able to also make recommendations that the other two bodies that have to do with police, the civil service and the fire and police commission, they can have a more active role in some of the items, such as, like, I'm thinking, if we really, I don't want to spread this commission, not our commission, but whatever the civilian review board will be, I don't want to spread them too thin and have them be responsible for a lot, especially when we have the civil service and the fire and police commission. As a fire and police commissioner, I know that we could be doing a lot more. So I hesitate to place things on them because it really is dependent on who is on the commission. I'll tell you my experience. It's been really hard to get our commission to be active, and I am pushing it all the time. I'm annoying them. But at the same time, if we have bodies in place, and if we stress the importance of having proper representation on those bodies, I wonder if we could place some of these responsibilities, such as looking at the policies, the training, the recruitment, those type of things could probably be handled in some of these other bodies. Probably the Fire and Police Commission would be more appropriate. Maybe not the current Fire and Police Commission, but future. So that way the civilian oversight could really look at the complaints that are coming in and spend that time looking at that.
And
So I guess my question is, would it be appropriate for this body, the CFC, in making recommendations for the civilian oversight, to also make recommendations for civil service and fire and police commission?
So Lizzie, I think that's a really good question. I'm actually going to hand that off to maybe John Joymus, just to see if that is within your authority.
Sure, thank you, Cami. Evening Commission. In terms of recommendations, I don't want to put a limit. Council doesn't want to put a limit to. They want to hear. So you're a mandate to see if there's a civilian review body for the city of Santa Barbara. There could be recommendations that you pass along with it that may include an extension of considerations for other bodies. But you also have to be aware that those bodies have their the two bodies you're talking about are city charter commissions. So they have their automatic power through the city charter. Then they have some additional powers through the adoption of the municipal code sections too. So that could be done. So I don't want to limit it recommendation. Councils could be able to hear what you need to say on this in terms of considerations to add additional powers or for other bodies out there. That's absolutely fine. Like you said, you're not limited. There's nothing in law that says, oh, you can't do that. So definitely don't want to dissuade you. If there's a reason or purpose behind that, absolutely do so. Again, these are recommendations, so there's certain freedom within that.
Thank you for that. Mary?
yeah, well, I mean, that's kind of, when we talk about straw polls or whatever, I mean, that's where my mind has gone for a very long time, since I was on the Fire and Police Commission many years ago. And so, John, I understand what you're saying and what you've said before. You don't want to limit us, but the bottom line is we also don't want to be going in a direction that then ends up, with some conflicts. And for instance, the Civil Service Commission, I was looking at their minutes a couple weeks ago, and they are hearing reviews of discipline. So I think it's very it's just a very realistic, like Christian, when you've talked about, kind of the level of, I forget what you called it, but things that need to change, or, that's where my mind went, is that, okay, whatever we end up recommending or doing, what is going to be the process? Because one way or the other, it's going to overlap with specifically civil service.
Sure. May I address that question, Commissioner
Yeah.
O'Gorman? That's an excellent point. And that's what one of my roles is here to help with, right?
Mhm.
I don't want to create a chilling effect for this commission in terms of recommendation, but I'm also here when I hear the recommendation is for this commission to hear all disciplinary matters. Then I could say, no, right, we're not allowed to do that. That's actually a city charter provision where all civil service employees can have their appeals heard by the Civil Service Commission after a Skelly hearing, and that's something that cannot be done so easy. That would have to be a vote, everything else. So that's what I'm here for as well. So just to clear up, I don't want to create a chilling effect in terms of recommendations. What I'm able to provide for the commission, besides any questions that regard procedural issues during meetings, is also my opinion and advice whether it's something we can do or consider if there's a conflict. And you raise an excellent point. You're 100% correct on that. So you're right. If there's a decision of like we should have a body that hears all disciplinary commission hearings for police officers, that would be their final level of review. Can't do that because we already have the Civil Service Commission, and it's within their charter, within these employees' rights to do so.
So I would imagine, though, and maybe Christian or Cameron, you've seen this because in California, I know there's other civil service commissions. I mean, there must be ways to reconcile some of those overlapping conflicts. I mean, that's kind of where I've been wanting to get to, for our discussions, because I know those are there. And in my mind, it's not a chilling effect. It's just a kind of a reality, so that we're not just kind of like playing house or something, and then it comes down to it and it's like, oh no, you can't do that, or how do we do it? So for instance, with the Fire and Police Commission, I know that there's already something in the charter that talks about or other powers as may be, or something, something like that. Well, so then does that open the door to maybe an easier sort of way to open the door, to more, or is it just anything that touches the charter we can't do?
Well,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, it's more discussion. I'd like to hear what you have to say.
So that's interesting. In terms of you don't want to conflict, right? But you can have parallel powers, right? So the Fire and Police Commission act as a administrative hearing body on certain things like dance permits, tow hearings, tow rotation lists, and then they act as a body that makes recommendations to the fire and police department on the selection of the fire and police chief on rules, or and as you say, there's a catch-all at the end. But there isn't mandated power versus, like, for example, the civil service that talks about all disciplinary matters can be appealed to the Civil Service Commission for a final decision within the city, right? Within the city. Then of course someone can take an appeal of that to Superior Court of their decision. So when it's running parallel, if the fire and police can make recommendations, then maybe another body can also make recommendations to a police body, right? Because it's not it's running in parallel. It's not necessarily conflicting. Right? What would stop there to be two advisories? Madison, Wisconsin kind of went through something on an issue on that because they had a very powerful fire and police commission, and someone wanted to consider a review body. And is there a conflict, or is it something where that's not an inherent conflict? So I think a lot of this would be saved on what if there is recommendations on other commissions, or if there is recommendations of, do we want this power to maybe for this recommendation you make have certain powers, if we get into the specifics, That's what I'm there for, right in the way in the beginning, to decide, okay, well, this we're preempted on. We're preempted on this issue in terms of adjudicating employment disciplinary matters, right, from the Civil Service Commission. But maybe in terms of reviewing policies and procedures for the police department, not necessarily. You're not preempted on that issue, right? So, and so when we have concrete determinations of like we want to go in this direction, that's what I'm here to help on that. So yes, some issues may be conflicted, some may not, right? And especially when you have a body that's there for recommending authority, you know, it's not, it doesn't have the same as, like, example, a Civil Service Commission that acts as a judge in employment matters. So there's a possibility to do both.
Thank you for the clarification, John. Appreciate that.
Theoretically then, though, let's say we have a review body with an investigation component. Would a determination there regarding a police officer be appealable or to the Civil Service Commission? Just theoretically.
Any discipline, any review would always be appealable to the Civil Service Commission.
So that's important for us to, yeah.
Yeah, and that's what I tried to outline my initial presentation, where, you know, they have that power to decide any appeal on any adverse action. And the adverse action would be termination, suspension, demotion. They would have the ability, police officers would have the ability to have it before the Civil Service Commission to make the final decision on that issue internally for the city. Correct.
Thank you.
And just to add, I think you'd be hard pressed to find an oversight entity in the country that there wasn't an extra level, that there wasn't recourse for an officer in matters of discipline. And John mentioned, excuse me, John mentioned Madison. They very carefully outlined in their ordinance to delineate the difference where the review board and monitors power ended and the police and fire commissions started. So,
okay.
Lizzie, did you have another comment that you wanted to make as part of this discussion?
Yeah, but just kind of reminding folks that the Fire and Police Commission also includes fire. So whatever recommendations are made for police review of policy and procedure, that would need to equally be done for the fire as well. So I personally don't think that the Fire and Police Commission should be have responsibility for overseeing complaints. I don't think that that's against police personnel. I don't think that that would be the wisest recommendation. But I think when it comes to certain operations of the department, it seems like it falls within that purview. But it's also important that when the city council appoints in those roles, that they're not appointing cheerleaders, because that seems to be what's happening now, is that the folks who are attracted to those commissions are folks who are already have high favor, high positive biases towards those departments. And so it's if someone like me comes in and I seem to be very antagonistic because I'm asking questions. So if there's any recommendations for that particular commission to do certain things, it's just keep in mind that it would have to be equally applied to fire as well, and that the recommendation also come with reminding council that they need to be aware of who they're recruiting or inviting and who they appoint for those commissions. I would love to see that commission be more meaningful, more impactful. And I'm not the first commissioner to try to move it towards that direction, and I hopefully won't be the last. We will have, just for the general public, we will have a vacancy coming up. So please invite folks that you think would have, you know, an impact, and do their homework to join the Fire and Police Commission.
Thank you, Lizzie.
Chair and Cami and Commission, just wanted to point out the question that Kim Johnson was trying to ask, whether all of the civilian positions mentioned in the hybrid systems and agency examples are paid positions or volunteer.
Okay, so the only volunteer positions are those normally of board members. So there are some boards that receive stipends for the work that they're doing. And then sometimes in addition, childcare is provided, some other things that make it easier for members of the community to participate on a regular basis. The rest of those positions, for instance, when we're talking about Seattle, all of those positions within the internal affairs, those are all paid positions. And I'm going to be honest, I try not to give too many opinions, but this one I will give. I have had some cities approach me and because when cities wouldn't support paid staff for things like investigators, they wanted to have volunteer investigators. I think that is not a good approach at all. That is a very specific set of skills, and I don't think people understand the number of hours that requires, and to ask a volunteer for that kind of commitment, I can't think of it leading to anything else but disaster. That's why you have paid professionals doing that work in investigator models. I will also say that there are some review board models to come to mind quickly who are smaller cities, and they do not have paid staff. They take care of everything. Ferguson, Missouri is one of them. They do have people within the city who provide some guidance, but they don't have a director. They don't really have any staff that's specifically assigned to them. And I think that also is I think that all boards should have some form of staff that can help guide them, because one of the wonderful things about civilian oversight is you're bringing together members of the community who have different perspectives and different experiences, and that may not be the administration of a board. That is a full-time job. And so that is something else to consider as you go forward. Christian?
So thank you for all of the information, and this is a lot to think about and process. And I'm thinking along the lines of how this is an investment, right? That requires budget and requires, in some cases, staff, if that's how we choose to go forward, paid staff, specialized staff who are overseen by the board or hired by the board, as you mentioned. And so one of the models that I've been increasingly attracted to is the auditor monitor focus, because I do think that that's something that we don't have currently, that actually invests time in looking at best practices, evaluating data, and making recommendations or enforcing best practices and policy. And so do the auditor monitor focus models typically have like paid staff that are focused on that, and then they're overseen by a board, or like what is the typical stance for or formation of the auditor monitor function?
So we see it really come about in 3 different ways. So you have cities like Akron, Ohio, that just, and New Orleans, I mentioned earlier, it's just an auditor monitor. In Akron, it is just one person, and that's it. So they perform auditing functions. There's not a review board. So that is one way that some do it. There are some like Tucson that have the auditor who does all of performs all the functions that you talked about in your presentation that an auditor would do. And then loosely works with a review board who one of their main functions is the community outreach piece, but they also, on a rotating basis, review cases. So they do perform that review function as well, but they kind of operate outside of the auditor's office. The auditor, they have their own director. The auditor doesn't direct them. And they do that because to them, that has a separation to it where it's almost like a double check on the work that's being done. Then, go ahead, Mary.
Curious so in that specific case, which agency or department is the auditor then connected to?
Well, I can tell you that, so now the auditor is part of the city managers. Okay. They're under the city manager. I think that the auditor at this point only is the police auditor, but there was a point in time where they split the job of the auditor. So they were the police auditor, and then they also were the director of human rights, the Human Rights Office. And there are several, so it makes sense that they're doing both of those things. But I think the work has increased, so they have separated it back out. But there are several cities, Cambridge is one of them, Massachusetts, where the director of that office has several hats that he wears.
Thanks.
Absolutely. And then there are also, like I mentioned before, there are entities like Madison who you have a board that reviews investigations and then also hires the monitor. And they work very closely together on things like policy recommendations, community outreach. So there are some overlapping functions, but then there are also some very separate functions. And I would say that more often than not, when we're talking about auditors, I think the Tucson model is very common now. I think that we'll probably see a movement towards what we've seen happen in Madison, where there's a little bit more collaboration.
Yeah.
Did that answer your question, Christian?
Yes, thank you.
Absolutely. Any other questions before we move on?
Oh, just one. In your study, the averages of costs, did you do any that talk about California separately? Just because our cost of living, I mean, I know in city and county jobs, no matter what it is, especially Santa Barbara and Southern California, it's sometimes triple what other areas are.
So in the numbers that Christian ran, I'm not sure if he did that. I know that in the database, you can filter out and look specifically at different agencies. One thing I might do is I can download the spreadsheet of data. I know, Christian, I think I provided the old one to you some time ago, but we have a new one that now has, I think, close to 20 more agencies in it. And like just yesterday, National City sent us their information. So there's a few more California ones as well to look at. But that would be very easy for you to do a sort function on that and just look at California. So I can put that on my list of things to send you after this meeting. That might be an easier way to look at that data. Although I do love playing with the map and all of the sorting features on the database.
Yeah, it would be great if we could get the raw data for the updated spreadsheet, so that I can make updates to the cost estimate portions of this, and share that out with folks, because it's a lot to view it in the spreadsheet, but I think that's what we want to pull the aggregated insights out of that, and then maybe have you check our work at Nick to help us make sure that we're being accurate.
Absolutely. I just have to I have to ask permission from our data guru. He doesn't always like it when I have control over the data, so I will get that from him, the new sheet, and send it your way. Any other questions?
Maybe we can get it added to the shared drive so that everybody can dig in or get a copy of it.
Okay, so if I send it to Sam, is that good then? Yep, I will do it. So if there aren't any additional questions, so let me just tell you about one of my fears of straw polls, is that I think it's really important for us to start narrowing down, but I also think that we have to have some thought about how we narrow down, because there are a lot of possibilities. So one of the questions, I think that if you guys feel ready to start having conversations about what you feel, where you're drawn as far as models are concerned, I think one of the things to maybe take off the table or narrow slightly is, do people feel most comfortable with a form of a hybrid? Or do we have those of you who might feel that there is one model that would be right singularly for the city? Because that will help us know that if we're going the hybrid route, that's a whole nother conversation, where then we can start talking about what pieces of the others you'd like to see included. But I do think we need to have that conversation first. And I think that is what I would like to throw out there for you, if you all are comfortable with moving into that phase.
Okay. I am most comfortable with the hybrid model.
Okay.
Am I?
I would love to hear from other folks who haven't talked as much in the meeting, but I think that just along the lines of best practices, hybrid does allow you, or it gives you the flexibility to custom fit for your community, and I think that would be something. It's the thing that I gravitated towards the most initially, and I believe that when we start to do community outreach, that we'll find much the same, that we want a custom fit for our community and our specific needs. But I would love to hear from other folks.
I'd second that. I think in reviewing all of these models, I think that there's a lot that we can pull from each of them. I like certain aspects of some, and I think it is the way, as Christian just stated, that we get the most custom fit for our community. So I would be more leaning towards the hybrid model myself as well.
I guess I'll jump in. For me too, I think the hybrid model provides us the flexibility, and yeah, and I think it also provides us flexibility later on to adjust after we've had feedback from the community on what our proposed recommendation is. It'll give us flexibility down the line to make adjustments.
I also agree with that. I'm leaning towards the hybrid model, mostly because it does leave us that flexibility after we get feedback from stakeholders. So I really appreciate that about that specific one. And like everyone else was saying, I think it'll be really nice to be able to tailor it specifically to our city.
Anybody who feels differently? I want to make sure all of the opinions are heard. Okay. So the next question I have, I know, you know, a couple of you mentioned that there were specific aspects of the other models that you would like, and that's why hybrid appeals to you. Can I hear, oh, and thank you, Kim. I saw your comment. Appreciate it. Can you guys start throwing out some of those specific things?
So this is, I think this is where the devil's really in the details, because it's not enough just to say hybrid, right? You have to say hybrid agency or hybrid system. And then once you've gotten past that, you have to say what aspects of each of these different models do we want to incorporate into either an agency or a system. It sounds to me like from the discussion that an agency would be ideal for a smaller community like ours, a smaller municipal police department jurisdiction. But like other folks have said, like Commissioner Rodriguez, we don't want to give a group like too many responsibilities to the point where it's not sustainable. So I think like one of the most intensive models that we see here is the investigation focused one because of the specialized one. And so I wanted to spend some time discussing that and whether and how we could incorporate investigation into a hybrid, or if we want to do that at all. Personally, I think that I like, just to start to kick the conversation off, like I think that an agency that oversees investigation has a lot of benefits, or would have a lot of benefits to creating the kind of independent oversight that can be effective at enforcing best practices in the police department and preventing misconduct.
I have a question, Cami, related to Christian's question, and are there any agencies out there, some hybrid agencies where, let's say they review the IA report and they come to the conclusion that it wasn't done to a standard satisfactory with the board or commission? Do any of them have the ability to contract out with an investigator and make that decision rather than hiring a full-time investigator?
Yes. In fact, a lot of the smaller agencies, that's what they do, because having a full-time investigator is not necessarily feasible or necessary. So they have a budget line item that is for contracting out specific services like independent investigations. So for example, I'll just go back to the Madison example. So the board reviews a case and they're unsatisfied with the investigation. They have a couple of options. They can send it back to be reinvestigated, or they can ask, they have actually two options. The monitor can do the investigation, or they can contract out to a third party to do the investigation completely. So that is, I know Madison is a larger city than Santa Barbara, but I definitely think that function is scalable if that's something that you're interested in. And by having a contractor rather than a full-time employee, it makes it even probably more feasible. So and what other pieces of the different models appeal to you that you'd like to have as part of a hybrid agency? Because, you know, before I go on, I'm sorry, I asked a question and then I cut off all possibility for you answering, but I just wanted to say, so if you guys are recommending a hybrid agency, I think it's important to remember, going back to the point that Lizzie brought up a while ago, is you already have 2 other commissions in place who are doing pieces of oversight. And so in a way, you're going to have a hybrid system because you've already got those pieces in place that will all be working together in some way, depending on how you set up the oversight, this particular oversight mechanism. So that's something also to consider as you're doing this. What about the board, having a review board, or a commission, and what role they might play in a hybrid?
I apologize to be taking up so much space. I have a lot of thoughts. So if anyone wants to go, please go before me. Okay, well,
you have the floor, Christian.
Yeah, I'll just say I really like the idea of staff, paid special.
Christian, I think your audio cut out.
Yeah, I had your audio cut out as well.
Okay, good. I was trying to figure out if it was me because no one else was reacting.
My audio there for a second. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. I'll start over. So I just really quick. I just really like the idea of paid staff. I think it's crucial. They're a person that has the motivation, right? A paycheck, the expertise, hopefully, you know, a career of doing this right in the field, and having the ability to be effective, right? Or at least manage the data and the processes versus unpaid volunteers. I think we can all agree. I view this as an investment, right? So to me, the bulk of that investment is paying for the expertise, paying for the effectiveness. And I also like the idea of having a board who is overseeing and helping with the decision making, because I think that it lends to the independence. We talk about the 13 principles that Nicole's laid out about what makes effective oversight. I think having a board aspect to it adds to that independence. Are there any thoughts on whether it should be a specialized commission or board, or whether the city council would just assume that responsibility? Any thoughts there from Cami or anyone?
I'm not sure I completely understand the question, Christian. I'm sorry.
So I think there's this idea of having like a paid staff person and some kind of appointed or elected board that oversees, that helps with the decision-making process, that reviews data, recommendations by staff, and votes on them, right? Or ultimately brings recommendations to whoever, right? The police department, internal affairs, or city council, or whatever. I'm just wondering if that's duplicative to like city council. Like, should that be council's function to sit on the board and work with that staff member, or should it be in terms of best practices an independently appointed board?
So I can tell you that most boards are, unless they're elected, and there are very few that are actually elected, most boards are appointed by city council or a combination of city council and either the city manager or mayor, depending on the form of the government, city government. Like in Indianapolis, the council appoints 5 of the members and the mayor appoints 4 of the members. And that there tends to be, someone's got to get them on the board. And so there tends to be, that seems to be the easiest way to appoint the members. Different cities have gotten very creative in how they make sure that there is, kind of going back to some previous comments about boards that are filled with people who seem to be very pro something when they're appointed. So cities more and more have gone to great lengths to make sure that they have people who are not necessarily pro, that they wouldn't come in as pro police or pro community, that they're there for the process, to make sure that the process works in a fair and just manner, benefiting both community and police in effect, because they're not there for one side or the other. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that tends to be the most common way of that being appointed. And then you have, from that point, the vast majority of staff is, well, directors have been appointed by either city managers, often city managers or mayors, depending on where what part of government that the oversight agency sits under. Like, for instance, in South Bend, Indiana, it sits in the city clerk's office. So that person appoints the director. So there can be some different ways that happens. That's how it is in the majority of time. And now, as we mentioned before, more and more we're seeing instances where the board actually hires the director, and then the director is responsible for hiring additional staff if necessary.
That makes sense. Does anybody have any thoughts about that formation where we're talking about a paid staff member that's overseen by an appointed board?
Something. This kind of goes into what I've been mulling this over, obviously, like the rest of us. And I like aspects of all three, obviously, because I think that's they all have their pros and cons. And I was wondering if there's a way for us to do it in such a manner that we get the best of those. And so what you're saying, Christian, I think if I'm understanding you correctly, we have a review board that is composed of people that are appointed by city council, for instance. That review board has a city staff person that they're accountable or that they oversee. Is that correct? That city staff person, I would be interested in that. If that, what I'd like to see is a review board that deals with most of the issues, and that there is, as we just made clear, that there's a line item that if an issue arises that they want some more investigation, or that something doesn't sit right for whatever reason, that they can hire an outside investigator. So I like that kind of concept, that they have the power to do that. But one thing, as I feel similarly to you, Christian, as you said earlier, that I've been leaning towards the auditor monitor model as well, is that I really like that they're able to analyze trends that have happened or that haven't maybe been caught for any number of reasons. And I remember, Cami, you gave a really specific example of it was almost so blatant that it was something that someone how they weren't being trained, or they were trained by a different agency. And it's something like that I would love to see that we actually get, but I'm wondering if that could be like an auditor monitor is hired as well, like a contract basis every 3 years or something, that there has to be a report of all policing, accountability structure that they've done, and that is reviewed by the review board as well. So essentially, I would like to see a review board that has the investment to get both investigation and auditor and monitor, if they so choose, through different timelines. So that's what I'd like to throw out there. I don't know if that goes in completely in line with what you were talking about, Christian, but that's my 2 cents.
Thanks, Rich. And that, I want to give a couple of examples of that. There are, that, well, actually not of that specifically, but that go along with that thought process. There are some agencies who the director also has the skills of an auditor as well. So they can act in both capacities, so that if you decide to do audits on an annual basis, on a monthly basis, biannual, whatever it is, that you have someone that's already there that has that capability. So that's one option. I also was thinking, Christian, when you were talking about the board that is able to supervise the staff, I wanted to give you a couple of other examples of how that works in some agencies, just so you have as much information as possible. So in some agencies, the board will do an annual review of the monitor or auditor. And it is a review that encompasses not only an internal review, like the board giving their opinion of the performance over the last year. They also do a community survey to see how the monitor is being received in the community. And then they also do an internal staff, anonymous staff review as well, so that they take all of this information and that comprises an annual review. If they see issues, then they make recommendations to, I think in this particular example, it is a mayor for removal for cause if they see problems. But they aren't able to hire and fire themselves. In fact, the hiring process involves a review of someone with oversight experience outside of the city, the public safety director, the mayor, and a appointee of the chief, and I think also a member of the review board. So it's a broader group than just the review board. So I just wanted to throw this out just to know that there are several options of how that can look, and how the board can be involved in the process of supervising the director.
I can.
And Sammy, if I may add too, how we work with employment in the city. For example, the city council, which is the only board that has the ability to hire and fire, it's only for 2 positions, the city attorney and the city administrator. In regards to everything else, and there are very powerful boards like the planning commission. They have staff dedicated to assist. But the way we're structured, wouldn't hire and fire staff. Obviously, there are issues, but that would generally be all those employees within the city administrator's office. So just wanted to add that. Okay.
Thank you, John. Mary?
Yeah, just to put it out there in case I have to go again to take care of the dog. But yeah, what I've kind of, especially after hearing from John about civil service and all that, is really looking at either a hybrid of the investigator and the auditor monitor with the review board. I don't think the review board, I don't think they should hire and fire, but I think having input, I know, I did that. I was the human relations director for the county for a while, and there were 2, the commissioners that were on the panel, and so I think there's ways to do it where there's genuine input. So I think that at this point would be what I would favor.
Sorry, Cami, either you're muted or you started to speak. Okay, so
go ahead, Christian.
I'm sort of curious too, because I feel like, when we decide on hybrid, we're kind of like, let's just do all the things. Like, let's have like a little bit of everything sounds good. But I do think we have to be a little bit more prescriptive, a little bit more specific. And I'm wondering if we could flip back in the presentation to the COAD table 2. Let me see what slide that is. That would be slide 14. Is there anybody running the PowerPoint? Okay, so just in the interest of time,
I didn't hear which slide you wanted, Commissioner.
oh, slide 14.
Got it.
So looking at slide 14, which is the table 2, combinations of oversight functions by oversight model. Maybe it's different on my screen. But anyway, my question is on the, yeah, there we go. So if we look at like the auditor monitor focused one, and folks that are also doing like investigation as part of that, it tends to be not very common that a like auditor monitor model is also doing investigation. And I'm wondering, I mean, like over a third of them are doing it. So it's not that it's uncommon, but I'm wondering why it's less common than some of the other formations. Cami, if you have any thoughts on that.
So I believe that one of the reasons for that is that this database only includes about 80 oversight agencies. And so we're missing, like Madison isn't in this yet because they haven't even hired their monitor yet. So they don't feel like they're ready to give us all the information. So there are some that aren't in here yet. And I feel like that is something that is a trend that we're seeing in the newer agencies who might not all be included in here. So that is my best guess. But I also think that, to be perfectly honest with you, independent investigation tends to be one of those things that when the ordinance gets created and the negotiations begin, that tends to be a huge sticking point. And a lot of times cities are like, or whoever is negotiating, eventually sometimes that becomes something that people are like, okay, if I can get this, then I will give up that. Because investigations tends to be something that some unions go completely after. And there are also some states that, and cities, depending what the union contracts say, make it very difficult to do independent investigations. But we are seeing that also as something that is becoming somewhat less of an issue where it has been before. So.
Yeah, no, I agree that we don't want to just do everything. I would say that we want to ask for a lot right now. And I think that's what Cami's getting at. I think we want to ask for the highest amount that we could possibly ask for. And then if we have to dwindle down, then we're able to. And that's why if we ask for budget line items for things like that, I think we might as well do it now, and even using that as a negotiation chip. I'm sorry, Gabe, go ahead.
Oh, no, I think just kind of following up on that, there might even be a way to make it more palatable too. And one way that I'm thinking of, just mulling over as we're all kind of talking, is maybe you have an auditor monitor and a board, and when they receive an investigation, if they find it not satisfactory, instead of immediately going to investigation, they send it back to IA for further details based on some of the concerns, and then they get the report again, an improved report that I imagine oftentimes addresses many of those concerns, and you never even have to get to the investigation, like contracting for an investigator. But let's say that you get the second report back and you don't get those concerns addressed or there's new concerns based on the information that you have, you then still have the ability to contract out with an investigator. And so there's still that accountability, but there's more collaboration.
I like that.
Let's do that one.
Okay, so ordered.
And you guys didn't think that you'd get all of this decided tonight. Who knew? Knew that you'd just move on to the next phase as well.
So Kami, one of my questions is, you were talking about if we have a review board and that I don't know what to call this person, the director of that board, that they also be auditor monitor focused as well. How realistic is it to hire a position that does all of that stuff? Even with what you were just talking about, with all of someone that is reviewed 360 by the community, staff, and the board, I just find like that would be a very hard position to fill.
Well, I think you'd be just, I would say absolutely 15 years ago, but the field of civilian oversight and related areas has grown to the extent that there are a lot of people out there. And there's also, particularly in the larger agencies, there are people who have been doing that work underneath someone for a period of time and are probably ready. They're looking to move up to the next thing. So there's a larger pool out there than you would think. And I think, pardon?
I just said absolutely. I mean,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, we do not need to get into this tonight, but I think when you start talking about qualifications and things, making it as broad as possible to really get a pool of applicants that can fit that. Like I know, for instance, some people are like, well, we need someone with 7 years of experience and an attorney, and like there are all of these different qualifications that then immediately might negate some very qualified people who have been doing the work for years. So those are things that we can talk about along the way, but I want to put your mind at ease. There are lots of people out there.
Awesome, thank you so much.
You're welcome. So I just want to kind of recap where we are. So I am hearing that you do want all things, but I think some of all of the models. I think when we get into the conversations about different authorities and what those look like and the extent, as Gabe mentioned, there are ways that you can lay that out that make it more palatable, and then also can include some other little nuances that will have true meaning to your community. But what I'm hearing is you're looking for essentially a hybrid of an auditor monitor model with a review board that has an independent investigative authority as needed. Is that a fair assessment?
that's fair enough. Yeah.
Okay. So what I'd like to do,
to talking about it more next month, or at our next meeting too, you know.
absolutely. And I think that at this point, I mean, I feel like you have had a conversation that has built a possible base based on what the additional conversation might be at the next meeting. But what I'd like to suggest at this point is that I can kind of put that in writing and for it to be sent out to the full commission so that people, if there are additional questions, so that we don't have any issues with people talking amongst themselves. If there are any additional questions or thoughts, if people want to send those to me, I will collect them. And then kind of that way we can, because at our next meeting, in addition to hopefully finalizing this piece, we do need to start talking about community outreach pieces. And that way we can kind of streamline that conversation but make sure all of the voices are heard as well. So if everyone is okay with that process, I think that we can consider this piece fairly well done for this meeting and then move on. If everyone is okay with that.
Yes, would you mind saying what you heard from us one more time? I'm not sure I got all of it, but I heard a hybrid model with auditor, monitor, and a civilian review to oversee, but I didn't hear the investigative in there, so could you repeat it in case I missed it?
Yes, and I apologize. It probably sounds like a frog is talking to you at this point. So a auditor monitor model with a review board that has independent investigative authority as needed.
Got it, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. That was a great conversation.
Yeah,
Thank you
so
for all the contributions.
thank you, Cami, for leading that and facilitating that conversation. So then what we need is a motion and a second to continue this item to our August 11th meeting.
So moved.
I second.
So Christian with the motion, Lizzie with the second. And Sam, if we could do a voice vote.
Sure, thank you, Chair Escobedo. The motion was to continue this item to the August meeting, first August 11th meeting, made by Commissioner Alonso, seconded by Commissioner Lizzie Rodriguez. All those in favor say aye.
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 Against? Motion passes.
Oh, sorry,
Awesome.
Commissioner, I just want to be clear, and what we're moving is the recommendation that Cami sent, an auditor, monitor, a review model with the independent investigation power as needed, correct? Because that should be clear in the agenda for public interest. I just want to make sure.
No, we're going to continue this conversation, but that is where we're at. That's where we're at in the conversation.
Got it. Okay. I wanted that clarification. Thank you for that. That's all.
Yeah.
I want to make sure.
And Cammie's going to send something out to everyone, and then if there's questions, we can direct them to you in the interim.
And should that be sent to you, Sam, for distribution?
Yeah, that's fine. I'm happy to be a kind of a, clearinghouse for some of these things, and then either distribution later or for compilation. Happy to help.
Thank you so much.
Perfect. So the two items that we have left, we have the continued timeline discussion.
Before we go there, would you mind, I just want to thank you so much, Cami, for leading us through this. And I felt like this was a really productive conversation from all commissioners. So I just thank you for leading us through there. Thank you, commissioners, for this really productive, informative process. Thanks.
And thank you, Christian, for the presentation. That was great. I like the new slides that you added.
Thanks, and yeah, I will go back and fix the topsy-turvy navigation of that to make it sure that it's followable and get that to Sam for distribution.
Great, thank you. So back to this discussion about the timeline, and now that we've had a productive conversation about models, I think we should be ready to adjust the timeline as needed.
So I can move the timeline, as the person that was skeptical, but
Perfect. Do we have a second?
What is the motion on the table?
to move the timeline as as is for now, knowing that it's, what's the
We're
word?
gonna
I'm
revisit.
losing my mental
Tentative.
capacity.
Are we
Tentative.
voting to approve the tentative timeline that we see before us here?
Mhm.
Mhm.
Okay. I second the motion.
Any other comments from commissioners? All right, Sam, if we could get a voice vote.
Yeah, let me just make sure there's no public comment on this item.
Oh,
It's-
correct.
I don't see anyone logged on, so there's no public comment. The motion is to approve the tentative timeline as presented by Commissioner O'Gorman. It's been seconded by Commissioner Alonso. All those in favor, say aye.
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 Against? Motion passes.
All right. So now we just have one more item, and it's our future business item. And Sam is going to pull up a draft agenda for next meeting. Just before we get into the discussion, we can't get into the specifics of any one of these items. This is more of a discussion of what will be on the agenda. So with that, based on the timeline, it would be a continued discussion that we had today, and then that would be followed by public outreach and development, and then a possible discussion about in-person commission meetings when it's appropriate. So preparing for that future time when we're able to all be in person and what that looks like and what are some of the accommodations.
Should we be making sure we can take action on any of these, like on the discussion, or is it just discussion?
That's up to you all. That's what I'm looking for feedback on. If you want to take action, that would be great to hear.
Always good to just have possible action, just that way we're covered.
And what sort of action would you want? Is this for public outreach or in-person commission?
No, well, on the civilian oversight models, I mean, if we're going to have a preliminary I don't know what we're calling it, recommendation or preliminary decision at least. But so just to kind of have that more concrete, I think with the public outreach, we probably need more discussion, and then maybe at the second meeting in August.
So maybe we can call it like the recommendations to the public as opposed to the council. And then the public can give us feedback that we can then modify and then give to council.
Could I suggest we just leave it as a kind of our tentative recommendation? Because I mean, it's for everybody, right?
I'm sorry, I'm somewhat confused about what we're talking about.
Well, if we're going to vote on something, so that's why I suggested that. So if we're going to vote on something that we want to approve this recommendation, it's something that we're presenting to the public as opposed to that we're presenting to council. So I had suggested that we call it, if we're going to vote in agreement that we're going to present this particular set of recommendations, it would be to the public. And that way we're not voting on what we're sending to the council. And maybe that's not needed.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's public meetings.
And I wonder if we have enough flexibility in the language as it is that to identify the preferred civilian oversight models, and it kind of keeps it there. And then it provides us enough flexibility to kind of change it in the near future or in the future. We're not sticking to one thing.
That sounds good.
Christian?
I'm thinking about action. I'm wondering if the action can be to direct the writing and drafting committee, which we don't have yet, so form it and direct them to draft our preliminary recommendations for further review by the public. What do you think about that?
I guess I'm not comfortable at that point yet. So
I think we have some discussions to later, and I'm looking at the timeline and getting more specific about the authority powers and more specific about the administrative details. And so I think at that point, after that, we can probably, that's in my opinion, that we can then send the writing group off. But maybe we start thinking, or in one of our meetings in August, select that group so that they can at least maybe do some research on recommendations out there.
Chair Escobedo, if I may too, I think, I never like to impose, but I think that's where later on, as you say, the timeline and me working with the writing group too. And that's where I feel a lot of my participation will be in terms of, we're talking about making sure there's no conflict in powers, where all the other issues we discussed tonight. So your comment, at least as is, because right now this is just an agendized item to talk about future business and not getting into detail. It has a flexibility. So the way it's worded, at least right now, this is for at least the commission to know what's on for next week for future businesses, or if they want to add something else to the agenda, what we're looking at. So that's where we should, the focus should be on. Thank you.
Understood. So in terms of content on this agenda, are there any items that you'd like to see on here that are not on here, or items that are on here that you'd like to push back?
I think this will keep us busy.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
I said I think this will keep us busy, but
I agree that this will keep us plenty busy, but I also would like to recommend that we add a short presentation on the makeup of an effective recommendation. So Serafina, as I've mentioned before, has done some work. She's reviewed some successful proposals, recommendations by other commissions, and put together a presentation of what goes into an effective or successful presentation or recommendation. So I would love to have the rest of the commission see that and start thinking about if they want to be on the writing and drafting committee, and what that would look like, and what the elements that they would need to bring to that initiative.
Would we want that presentation at this meeting, or maybe at the second meeting of August?
yeah.
I think either or would be fine.
I agree with Christian. I think either one is totally fine. It seems kind of like we have a lot on this one at the moment. So if we have a little bit less, maybe on the second meeting in August, that might be slightly better.
Perfect.
And maybe, Cami, we could get some additional recommendation drafts or examples to enhance that in the meantime.
Absolutely. And then I'm happy to talk with you about them, be on your calls if needed.
Okay, so I think we'll take that as an action item for the working group then, Serafina, if that sounds good to you and Kim.
Perfect. Any other comments on this or future business that you want to see in August?
Well, I would say, I don't know if it's future business or it's already on our timeline, and I hesitate to get into too much detail because this is just general comment, but that we do agendize something soon, whether it's with Sean and or the union, but just to talk more specifically as a group about current investigation processes. He sent us an example of an investigation last week, and so just so we can actually have a conversation, I guess. And maybe if it, inviting the union to a meeting just so that they're hearing this stuff sooner rather than later. We've talked about it a few times, and so we can just try to have that at a future meeting. Again, I don't want to go into any more detail, but that's that.
A follow-up question, would that be inviting the union to present or just invite to be at the meeting?
Well, just invite them to the meeting, and then, they always have, like anybody, the opportunity to, speak and comment, but so they're at least hearing where we're going.
Sounds good. Any other comments on that or anything else? Everyone feel comfortable with that?
Just one more quick one, and this doesn't have to be for the next meeting, but I brought this up before. I think it would be really beneficial for us to hear from the civilian oversight community. Obviously, NACOL is a very large part of that community, but I think from someone who's in practice currently and who is doing a model that is similar to the one that we've discussed tonight and that we'll continue to discuss at the next meeting, me personally, like, it would be really, really helpful to hear from someone who's implementing, executing on a civilian oversight model live, like in real time, and to answer questions for us on, like, what do you know now that you wish you knew then?
Perfect.
Back to Commissioner O'Gorman's comment about inviting possibly the police union. If we are going to be inviting them, I think we should also invite other stakeholders as well, and not just one. Yeah, so maybe
Again, I'm a little uncomfortable with this item because we really can't get into back and forth. I specifically brought them up. Again, it's a public meeting. Everybody can go. We're going to be talking about outreach and other groups. I think Cammie has brought up many times. It's just having them there. I mean, anybody can come.
Yeah. Definitely.
Understood.
I think that to give guidance and to help during this agendized items, offer a suggestion. We don't have the commission doesn't have to go to avoid Brown Act. Don't go over the back and forth of the merits of why or why not. So, and that'll make everyone feel comfortable. So if we have,
I can't hear you too much.
Oh, can you hear me at all? I'm sorry. Does it come in at all or no?
Yeah.
Better.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Just as I was saying, this item's here to offer suggestions on what we want to place, but not a back and forth on the merits. And if you operate under that premise, you'll be fine. So if there's a suggestion to invite, and then do so. And then we have our process and procedure. Contacting the chair and vice chair. If there's a group that you want to invite to do a presentation, please do, and we can place that on the agenda and have that there, and it'll be clear and specific. So.
Thank you, John. That's very helpful. Any other suggestions before we close out this item? All right. John, do we have to do public comment on this item?
Well, every item, but okay. I don't see any attendees. So, but we'll open it, okay. Sam, if you want to open it, but I don't see any attendees. Yeah.
There are no attendees in the public portion of the meeting, Chair.
Perfect. So with that, thank you all for a good meeting and a good discussion today. Thank you, Cammie, for leading the discussion. Thanks, Sam and John, for always being supportive and guiding us through the meeting. We will adjourn the meeting at 7:49. Good seeing you all. See you all in 2 weeks.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.